Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in Internet Shitlords. And, well, today I've brought out my whole medieval authentic collection here. I've got, there's Dark Albion, Lion and Dragon, and there's the old school companion, which has just hit Electrum bestseller on DTRPG, so you should really check it out. But, little did I know when I was designing these games that I was actually, contributing to ethno-nationalism. At least that's what's going on in the latest tweet craze in Twitter from the D&D SJWs, where someone said that in fantasy settings that have kingdoms with borders are basically ethno-nationalism, right? Like they're ethnostates, right? There shouldn't be any ethnostates in fantasy, and this has been tweeted 1,500 times, right? So I just can't believe the stupidity of this. But okay, let's break this down. I mean, you could just say, well, that's just, completely idiotic, and that's it, folks. Please support me on Patreon and PayPal if you like, or buy my products, and we'll see you next time. But no. But hang on. Here's I think we should kind of just analyze every detail about this thing, because it just seems really funny. This person named, I think, Natalie Reed did this tweet where they said, I'm saying they because I have no idea what they are, right? Said, aren't you sick and tired of something like, aren't you sick of having fantasy settings with where there are clearly defined kingdoms with borders acting as ethnostates or something? It's like, yeah, okay. And then they elaborated on this in the further tweets and the comments of the tweets, that apparently, this is bad, not just because, obviously it's somehow, white supremacist or something like that, but also because there were no such thing as ethnostates in the Middle Ages, right? Well, okay, let's start with the thing that they're right about. It's true, there were no ethnostates in the Middle Ages, because there's never ever been hardly, with the exception of Nazi Germany and one or two other places, a few third world shitholes in Africa, but for the most part, there's never been ethnostates, right? Ethnostate is a kind of idiotic made up term, right? I mean, there are a couple of cases it applied. Obviously, the actual German Nazis, right? They were kind of, you could say, an ethnostate, or rather, they were a state that had been taken over by virulent ethnic racists, right? That were that had a theory of racial supremacy, etc., right? But in the Middle Ages, there wasn't anything like that. That's true, of course, right? But that's because there was never a thing like that in general. The key assumption that they're putting into this tweet, this argument, is that all states are ethnostates, right? That's their fundamental argument, right? If you have a state with a defined border, it is by definition a racist ethnostate, right? These are people that want a world with no borders at all, and with no controls over who can come in and take whatever they want, right? That's anything that isn't that is an ethnostate to them, right? And this is where they create this trap. So you see, they get other people, because I've seen other people arguing against that, oh no, it was unrealistic, and then of course that's a huge trap, right? I've seen other people arguing against the idea that, that it doesn't really matter because it doesn't have to, because it's fantasy, right? Stuff like this, right? But I haven't seen people realize that they start, and this is always the right technique. This is a technique Foucault was teaching these people, right? What talk about the control of language and the definition of terms, right? The assumption that's hardwired into that tweet is that any state with a border is an ethnostate. Therefore, all medieval European states were racist ethnostates. And therefore, the only real answer, the only way that you can correctly win this stupid prize, this stupid contest, right, and get the dumb prize of collapsing Western civilization, is by saying, yes, you're right. There should be no fantasy settings that are based on medieval Europe or anything European for that matter, or in fact anything resembling any part of most of human history, because of course, there were certain dynasties in Han China which you could have decided, or in Imperial China which you could have defined as ethnostates, right? Not all of them. The Song were very cosmopolitan, and then obviously the ones that were actually ruled by non-Chinese invaders that came in, that swarmed in through their borders. Those tended to be at least multi-ethnic, because the new ruling class was not the actual Chinese people. So there were some exceptions there, but for the most part, most of the world has had defined territorial states, right? Like once you get to a certain point in civilization, it goes like this. First there is just there's tribes fighting over bits of land, and then there's city states, and then the city states evolve into kingdoms or empires, right? Now, I've heard some people say, well, but in the Middle Ages, the lands were like belonging to the king, and people thought of themselves as servants of a king, but not as a people, right? And that's a theory of history that has become very popular lately, but it really doesn't pan out when you start to give it the slightest bit of serious thought, right? Because in the medieval world, there were very definitely people that considered themselves the English, right? And there were people that considered themselves the Scots, for example, and the French, right? They were such a sense of defined ethnic self that, without a doubt, when the Normans invaded England and you had the Norman upper class and the English lower class, or rather better put, the Saxon lower class, those two stayed separate for hundreds of years, right? Like the ruling class that had been the Norman invaders kept on speaking Norman French or Latin and having their own customs, their own dress, their own traditions, and their own behaviors, completely different from the people they ruled over for like literally centuries, right? But they knew that where they were ruling over was the land of the English, right? And it took them a long time. It took them really until about the 15th century, 14th or 15th, before they would really be understood to be English, right? And not, Frenchmen ruling over the English. So there were definitely defined ethnicities, and it wasn't that people just didn't think of themselves in those terms. And there were kingdoms that were defined by those ethnicities, right? The Poles were separate from the Germans, right? And they had their own system. The Polish Commonwealth, the Hungarians, the Hungarians were often controlled by other people, but they tried to have their own kingdom as well. Matthias Corvinus, if you read the Dark Albion book, it talks all about what's going on the continent, and it's a bunch of different, usually organized by ethnicity states, right? Now, the Germans weren't unified, right? They're divided into all these different princedoms that were part of the Holy Roman Empire, right? The Italians weren't unified, but they were still kingdoms of Italians, right? Now, beyond that, though, like, what they're actually saying doesn't belong in fantasy. It's not like they're calling it the ethnostate, but what they've done is they've just taken the Westphalian nation state, which is not an ethnostate, and put a line through that and put in the words ethnostate, right? So obviously, here's the thing. There were these massive conflicts that took place largely because of wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries that caused massive deaths all over Europe. And then this was resolved ultimately by the Treaty of Westphalia. And the part that was important about that treaty, if you listen to a lot of people today, you would think that, that treaty was the moment, because before that, people didn't think of themselves as ethnicities living in certain nations, right? It's just that they just thought of themselves as vassals of such and such king, right? Well, ask Charles of Spain whether the Netherlanders thought of themselves as his vassals, right? Like, ask all these people who've rebelled against what they saw as foreign lords, if they thought of themselves just as vassals and that was their political alignment, right? That's completely wrong. The Treaty of Westphalia, the reason it was important was because they were wars of religion, and the treaty established that a king had the right to control the religion of his kingdom, right? So that basically it put an end to the efforts of certain countries allying, well, in theory it put an end to it, didn't completely, but it came close, of certain countries allying with the Protestant or Catholic minorities of the other countries in order to create civil strife, and then going to war and invading and trying to, there was this big fight between Protestant countries and Catholic countries, but there were lots of Catholic countries with Protestants in it and Protestant countries with Catholics in it. And the Treaty of Westphalia, the central detail of it was the king rules the nation, right? And then decides what is the dominant religion of the nation, and that there was a kind of a diplomatic process where these nation states would recognize each other's sovereignty over what goes on within their own lands, right? That was the great innovation. It started with religion, but it became bigger than that later on, right? But none of that is an ethnostate, because they weren't ethnostates, because they were just states ruled by a king, right? It didn't matter, for example, that what would become the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right, had a number of different ethnicities within it. That was still a nation state. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a nation state. It was a nation state with many different ethnicities in it, but it was one single nation, right? The United Kingdom of Great Britain is a nation state. It's not an ethno-state. It had many different ethnicities within them, right? And as had the Kingdom of Spain, right? Spain had multiple ethnicities in it, though the Spaniards sometimes tried their best to reduce that, but that's another story. Anyway, the point is that these sorts of sophisticated nation states, it's true, those didn't really exist in the Middle Ages, because what you had in the Middle Ages was that you had a king who was the ruler of an entire people, and who had certain properties of their own, but beyond that was the sovereign liege lord of the people. Those people were ruled over by nobles who had allegiance to the king as their sovereign liege lord. And those nobles controlled different little pockets of territory all over the place. And there was, there was very little, there was a king's law, even by the time certainly of the Dark Albion Lion and Dragon sort of settings. There was already a king's law, but the law was very decentralized in general to the local magistrates and aristocrats and what have you, right? So this was a gradual process. The nation state wasn't born with the Treaty of Westphalia. It was something that evolved from the late Middle Ages until that time, and then continued being developed after that. But you had these kingdoms that weren't really single coherent federalized bodies, so to say, right? But they were ruled by a king who was a hereditary ruler over territory, and also the representative, God's chosen ruler on earth over a certain peoples, right? By right of birth and blood, but also by divine right. And so that's what a medieval nation was. It wasn't about an ethnicity. It wasn't about dominating one ethnicity over another. But it did usually have some kind of borders. Now there are, you could show maps that, especially in the area of around like France, where, and the Holy Roman Empire, of like weird little pockets of territory that belonged to this and that person, right? France especially had a very, very weak monarchy, so you had like people like the Duke of Burgundy that was basically, Burgundy was essentially an independent kingdom for a lot of its history up until the late 15th century. But there was still a very clear sense of when it stops being the land of the Frenchmen, right, and of the Frankish people, and when it becomes the land of the Germans, right? For a number of reasons. There's more than just, there was necessarily a single defined border line. but there were nations of people in the Middle Ages. There were kingdoms, for starters, and those had definitions, very strict definitions because of heredity and things like that. And yeah, okay, so the English king had a claim to a whole bunch of territories in France, but that was because he wanted to become king of all of France, right? The fact that there were these conflicts doesn't negate the fact that kingdoms existed in the Middle Ages. And they weren't based strictly on ethnicity, right? The later Westphalian nation states were not based strictly on ethnicity. They had nothing, it wasn't about this is the land of this race and this is the land of that race. This is the problem with seeing everything through this ridiculous modernist lens, right? And in fact, let's point that out. Like, it's very funny, Natalie Reid, that you're so worried about there being defined ethnostates or nation states or whatever you're pretending to call racist, which wasn't. But let's say you've got this worry about how, you know, they're injecting modern political concepts of statehood into the Middle Ages, and that shouldn't be allowed, right? While at the same time, you're claiming that every RPG essentially has to have a complete racial diversity, and every RPG has to be full of, has to be as a setting, a place that's tolerant of LGBTQ plus, and, you know, people should be talking like, oh my God, oh, so random, right? Like, it's got to be 2020 Seattle. We've got it, every setting should be 2020 Seattle, right? Like, that's where it's got to be. And you want to impose your entire system of morality and of pop culture into every fantasy setting. In fact, you demand that any system that doesn't have that, any setting that doesn't have that, is either racist or sexist or homophobic and should be eliminated. So let's not pretend that your deep concern here is realism. It isn't. Your concern here is an assault on every traditional fantasy setting because you hate traditional fantasy. You also hate D&D. We all know this. You hate all fantasy games. Your purpose is not for that. Your purpose is to attack and destroy what you see as your enemy, which is to say Western civilization, right? You have this hatred of everything essentially about the West, a self-loathing, obviously, because you must, you know, I'm figuring that whatever you are, you come from the West, and you're in fact a product of the West, and only the West could have become so advanced, so prosperous, as to create someone so useless as you, right? In any other place in the world today or in the past, you would not have been able to be what you are now, which is both the triumph and the tragedy of the West, right? Of people that are so pampered and so spoiled that they're longing to destroy not just themselves, but everything that created them, not realizing what they have. You know? That's what you are. You're dirt, okay? And really, your purpose of trying to undo traditional fantasy, you know that's not going to work, right? Nobody is going to give a damn about it. Because there's a problem here, is that deep down underneath, much more powerful than all the postmodernist indoctrination that the people that have pushed into your head have also pushed into all the schools, deeper than all of the politically correct slogans, deeper than all of the, Antifa brainwashing, there are these fundamental elements of myth and legend, of archetype, that come to the root of everything that we are. And of course, there's about 8% of the population that are so broken that that just doesn't even work for them anymore. But for everyone else, aside from the 8% of the population who are literal SJWs, everybody else, there's something that you will never be able to replace with the shallow and meaningless, intentionally meaningless, because the entire purpose is to say there's no meaning to existence, this nihilistic view of postmodernism. You can't take that and make that, you'll never be able to make it more popular than the power of history, the power of myth, and the power of legend, which is what, fantasy games and fantasy settings, not just Western myth and legend, all myths and legend, but of course the Western myths and legends are especially significant to us in the West because we are products of the West, right? And so we, it's super cool to hear about the Monkey King, and you can relate to the Mahabharata and to Krishna. You can enjoy those sorts of things, but when you're talking about Camelot, right? When you're talking about Robin Hood, there is something that comes deep within our visceral nature in a place of intense spiritual feeling, right? That you can't defeat with this kind of shallow promise of empty, meaningless, non-engagement, right? Because that's all you offer in the end. You offer the eternal now. That's it. Year zero, forever, right? Destroy everything, and it's always going to be year zero because anything else will create inequality or hierarchy or whatever. And this is what you have to give people. While we have thousands of years of human history and all of the magic and the gods and the heroes and the monsters that we have cultivated in our subconsciousness for all that time. That's why you're going to lose, right? That's why no amount of pushing, the progressive stack importance of your candidates is going to beat a candidate who ends up tapping into an archetype the way, God Emperor Trump has, for example. So, you're a blip in the scale of history. And just remember that. I want you to know that, because I'm sure you're probably going to be watching this at some point. And for the rest of you, I want everybody else to understand that too. They try to destroy medieval fantasy, not because it's frivolous and because they're petty, but they are petty, and it is a little frivolous, but because it's part of that fabric of the bigger thing they want to tear apart. It's one thread they want to pull out of the bigger fabric of the entire values system of the West, which ironically produced them, because no other civilization would be so tolerant as to produce something so useless as the sort of people that make these kind of tweets. Anyways, I guess that's it for today. That's enough of a rant from me. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Please share it everywhere, especially where it'll piss people off. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Welcome once again to any new subscribers who've joined me. Thanks to Sargon of Akkad. I really appreciate your shout out, Sargon, if you happen to be listening to this. And I hope you enjoyed the video too. And if you want to support me, well, you can send me money on Patreon or PayPal. There's links in the description below. But you could also, in those same description below links, purchase my products. And I'm sure you're going to find stuff you're really going to like, right? Like, why buy game products that are made by people who despise you when you can get game products from people who don't really care who you are as long as you just want a game, right? And they don't want to kick you out of the hobby or to force you to change or to make you game stuff you don't want to game as a punishment for some perceived moral misdeeds or something like that, right? I just want you to have a good time. And so check out stuff like, Lion and Dragon. It's the greatest old school rule set for playing actual medieval authentic gaming. Whether you're looking to recreate the War of the Roses or Game of Thrones, it's got that same kind of gritty style. The Old School Companion, if you've already got a favorite system, if you've got Lion and Dragon, the Old School Companion is the perfect source book, but if you've already got some other system, the Old School Companion is still a source book you can use to bring in a bunch of medieval authentic elements, including magic and fairies and the aristocracy, and you could just add a whole bunch of stuff, mechanics and setting stuff, into your existing game. And of course, Dark Albion, the Rose War, which is my fantasy setting, a fantasy version of the War of the Roses in the 15th century, which is all three of them are bestsellers now, so you check those out, or check out the RPG Pundit Presents series on PDF. If you've only got a few bucks, for, you know, all of them are under $4.99 except Star Adventure, which is a complete space opera RPG. That's RPG Presents number 100, which you can get for just $9.99, and you can get that in print for $9.99. All the other ones are PDF. But anyways, all the PDFs from 99 cents to $4.99. You got 102 of them now. So you're going to find something, some topic. One of the RPG Pundit Presents series is going to really call out to you in terms of something you could use in your RPG campaign, right? So look them up, pick one up. It's like you're buying me a coffee, but you're also getting something for yourself. And that's what I like to do is I like to make products that people are going to enjoy for themselves. By the time this video is out, it's just possible that RPG Pundit Presents number 103 might be out, which is Exeter and its Environs, which is a medieval authentic city guide. It's based on actual medieval Exeter with all the you know, the details of the city, the, you know, geography, the things in it, how the society of the city worked, and myths and legends that come from parts of the history of Exeter in real life, a real life city, medieval city that you can use as a base for your campaign. You can use it as a place in your campaign. You can add it to your fantasy campaign as an especially medievalish sort of world. And you know, it's a really great product. It's just another one of the city guides that are already, because I've made a couple before, so this is another one. Yeah, though people seem to like those city guides, so I made one more. Anyways, that's everything for today. Support me with my products, support me on PayPal or Patreon if you like, and most of all, subscribe, like this video, and share this video. Thank you very much. Currently smoking Lorenzetti Half Volcano plus Argento Natural.